Welcome to the Boone County History and Culture Center's Meet the Author program. Our goal is to provide conversations with Missouri authors or people who know a lot about Missouri. I'm David Weber. For the past almost year, we've been offering Zoom interviews because of the pandemic. I look forward to going back to in-person presentations on the third Saturday of every month. Our guests with today are James Irwin and Vicki Berger Erwin, author of Notorious, Missouri, 200 Years of Historical Crimes. This book is available at, I know it's at Barnes and Noble, it's at the State Historical Society, and of course it's online. So welcome, Jim and Vicki.
Thank you.
So tell me, how did you get the idea to write this book?
You tell.
Our editor that we worked with on a couple of other books wrote me a note and said, would you be interested in doing a bicentennial book about Missouri? 200 years, fill in the blank. And so I wrote back and said, could we do true crime? He's also a big true crime guy. I mean, that's how he did. The first book that I did with him was a true crime book. And he was like, he jumped right on it. So that's how it came about.
Yeah. And I know that you're from Kirkwood, and I do remember the incident that you end the book on, actually, the 2007, I guess, Kirkwood City Hall murder. How important was that in the history of Missouri?
Well, I think that it out a lot of different things that were going on, and I'm sure they were happening in places other than Kirkwood. For example, one of the precipitating events probably in that situation was that a historically African-American community was encroached upon or bought out for the purposes of a commercial development. And, you know, that was one of the things that happened initially. And I'm sure that was happening other places as well. And I think it was a call that, you know, let's pay attention to what's going on here and, you know, before something bad happens.
Yeah. As I say, I do remember that. And I think other people our age would probably recall that too. So can you give me a overview of the book? I mean, how would you describe this to someone who hasn't read it yet?
Well, we tried to cover 200 years from the beginning of Missouri as a state, or actually the first one is Missouri was a territory, up to nearly the present day. We tried to cover all parts of the state. So when we first started it, we had a lot of things from St. Louis and eastern Missouri because that's where we're from, that's where we're living. But then we, decided we need to have things from other parts of the state. So it's St. Joseph and Kansas City and other places, a little bit from Southwest Missouri. And we tried to cover something from all the time periods in the 19th, 20th, and into the 21st century.
So was it hard to narrow it down to these 15? I mean, could have you written a book twice as long?
Oh, yes.
Easily.
There were about at least 3 or 4 chapters that were written that didn't make it in the book because of excuse me.
Because of word limits. I mean, we had a very specific guidelines to follow as far as the photographs and the length of the book. And in fact, one of the things that we had to reduce down was all of our newspaper resources, because since museums and research libraries were not open during the pandemic, and that was the period when we were researching this, we relied a lot on newspaper for information.
Yeah. No, and I know some of these I knew about Jesse James and Wild Bill Hickok and Frankie and Johnny.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But some of these I had never heard of. Like, and I knew of Swope. Is it Swope Park in Kansas City? but I didn't know that story. Maybe one of you would take a couple of minutes and tell us about that.
Yeah, I didn't know about the Swope Park thing either. And I knew of Swope Park. I didn't know how to about, and I found out it was Colonel Thomas Swope, who was a very wealthy real estate guy in Kansas City, that had a mansion actually in Independence, where several members of his family lived. And he had this rather unusual will in which he was going to be leaving money to his nieces and nephews, or at least those that survived him. And he was getting ready to change the will, apparently, to leave it to money to charities instead of to the nieces and nephews. And just before he changed the will, he died under suspicious circumstances. And then later, one of the nephews died, also under suspicious circumstances. And suspicion fell upon Dr. Hyde, who was the husband of one of the nieces. And he was the one actually who was tried for the murders. Tried, I guess, 2 or 3 times actually. First time it was reversed. The second time they went to trial while one of the jurors absconded, and they had a mistrial. But in any event, it was quite an interesting story. It was one of those things, sort of like a soap opera or something, with the family interactions and disputes, inter-family disputes, and so forth.
So, how did you do research on that one? Because that's probably not in many books or.
Well, actually, there is a book. I believe it's Truman State University Press, which had a lot of the information about it. And of course, there were newspaper articles that were published at the time. It was a very highly publicized event in Kansas City, and at the time.
Then one of the other ones I didn't know about was, I think, from Mexico. Was that the one, the Angel of Mercy, the Angel of Death?
No. The Mexico murder was a society woman who was walking home from downtown on Thanksgiving Eve in 1937, and she was attacked from behind and then pulled behind a vacant house where her attacker was scared away. And then she was later found and died without regaining consciousness. I'm actually from Mexico, Missouri. And I did not know about this case when I was growing up in the town. And when I found out about it, it was something that kind of I started obsessing about it because I had known about it, and it's unsolved to this day. I mean, no one knows who actually perpetrated the murder.
And one of the interesting coincidences about it was that the family was being visited at the time by folks from California, and their names were Mr. and Mrs. James Erwin.
Really?
No relation.
No relation.
So you haven't been charged yet, I guess.
No.
So, what did you say? That was 1937?
Yes, 1937.
So I would imagine we've all been brought up. We probably brought up in the 50s and 60s.
Yes.
So
we were not alive in 1937. Neither one of us.
No. I know, but that would only be 20 years old. So you would think someone in Mexico would have.
Yeah, I have no idea why I never really heard of that as I was growing up, but it was something that I found out about later. So.
Yeah. Then one of the other ones that caught my attention was I think William Owens.
Right.
I guess his property became Washington, Missouri.
Correct. And he always intended to found the town of Washington. He just was murdered before he had a chance to finish all the sales and paperwork and everything that you had to do to create a town at that point in time. And it is another unsolved murder. He was shot in the back on his way home from doing business one evening. There were suspects. There were 2 people that he was involved with in a legal dispute. And both of them were arrested and brought in. But at the time, there was no jail facility. So they were let out on bail and they absconded, never to be heard from again. And so, again, it was an unsolved mystery. His wife did go on to found the city of Washington.
And wasn't there some legal innovation or something about how she bought the property?
It was very confusing because he sold it in a way that contract for sale, which I believe Jim's the legal person here.
Yeah, I was going to ask him. Yeah.
There's a contract for deed, which
Okay.
which basically you enter into a contract and after you pay for it, why then you get the deed. You don't get a deed with a mortgage or as you would normally do today. It's an unusual and highly disfavored way of doing it these days.
And she ended up having, and also property did not pass automatically to a widow upon the death of the husband. She had to buy back all of the property and then resell it to create the town.
So I know down in that area, there's also Owensville.
Yeah, I don't think that
is
has
that related?
anything to do with them.
Nothing to do with
I know it doesn't. As far as I know, it's not.
Yeah. So
they were from Kentucky. They originally moved from Kentucky.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. And then which of these are your favorite? Do you have any ones that you like?
Yeah, for me, it's the Mortimer murder. I'm absolutely fascinated about it. I mean, not only was the murder itself kind of, bizarre to me and the way that they investigated, which was to, as far as I can tell, and I've asked and tried to research all the reports, and there's nothing available from the State Highway Patrol or the police department. But what I've researched was they pretty much focused their attention on any African American in the community. They brought in a man who we had never heard of, named Ira Cooper. He was a Black lieutenant in the St. Louis Police Department. He was the highest ranking Black police officer in the whole country at the time. And he was often called in as a consultant, not only in the state, but around the world. He had worked with Scotland Yard and other places. And they called him in because he had been born in Audrain County, which of course is where Mexico's located. And they called him in to try to help them solve the crime. Unfortunately, he did not take written notes on his cases, did not keep written notes. And when he returned to St. Louis, he fell ill. And so, it kind of came to nothing. Like I said, the case is still unsolved, but that's my favorite.
My favorite, Stagger Lee and Frankie and Johnny. And what caught my attention was that both of these very famous songs arose out of killings that happened in St. Louis just a few years apart. I think it was 4 years apart and just a few blocks apart. And, it was, that's kind of what got me interested in it. And of course, I love the songs too. I remember them from when I was a kid. I remember the Lloyd in 1959. And also I thought that Frankie Baker was a very interesting woman. She lived with Alan Britt was actually the guy that she killed. It wasn't a guy named Johnny. The composer of the song changed the title because of his family complained about it when it became so popular. But she was willing to take on big corporations, movie companies to sue the nation. She wasn't successful, but she tried. And she came to St. Louis in 1942, a very highly publicized case, testified. There were people who claimed that she didn't write the songs, or the songs weren't about her, rather, that was written sometime in the Civil War. But one of the people they cited as being an expert on such songs happened to be Ira Cooper, who was, in addition to being
he was the reporter.
He was a reporter, but he was an expert on the songs. And he had identified the composer of the songs as being a man named Bill Dooley. who was a black pianist and songwriter in St. Louis in the 1890s. And in the 1890s, he was as famous as Scott Joplin and W.C. Handy. And he was identified apparently as writing both of those songs. Same guy, 2 songs, 4 years apart, a few blocks apart.
So when were the songs written? I thought they were 1920s?
1895.
1895? Oh, I'd forgotten that.
And then Frankie and Johnny was probably written within a few days, if not the next day, in 1899.
Oh, wow.
They weren't actually recorded until the 1920s because recording technology wasn't really well developed. But they and then they were recorded hundreds of times over the years, both of them.
I do remember the song Frankie and Johnny, but I also remember the mural in the state capitol, Thomas Hart Benton.
Yes,
which is probably I think that was done in the 1930s, maybe.
1936, I think, is when he completed it.
Is that right? Yeah.
And he completed that in 1936. There was one of the panels is Frankie and Johnny.
Yeah.
It's actually a pretty controversial mural at the time because one of the panels included Tom Pendergast from Kansas City.
That's right. Yeah.
And people said, well, why do you have Pendergast in here? Why do you have slavery in here? Why do you have these things? And he said, well, because it's the social history of Missouri. You can't ignore history. It's what it was, and I'm going to paint it. And he did.
I wonder if anyone's ever written a book just on parts of that mural. You could probably get 20, well, not murders, right? I mean, there's also some good things.
Yeah, there's good. Yeah. There's some stories you could get off of that mural. I mean, he's got Jesse James, for example, is in there, and others. But
and then, of course, I think the first story you talk about is Thomas Hart Benton, the senator.
Yes.
I knew he was our first senator. I don't remember that he had murdered someone or a duel, I think. But
it was a duel. Many of the elite in eastern Missouri, St. Louis, in the territorial era in the first few years of the state, they were from the Upper South, where the so-called Code Duello was observed. And if you insulted someone, they could demand satisfaction, and you had a duel. Duels were illegal. They're illegal in the territorial law, and they're illegal under the first laws of the state of Missouri. But generally not. That law generally was not enforced. Well, he and Charles Lucas got into a dispute at election time when there was an election for the territorial representative to Congress. The territory was allowed to have one, and Lucas claimed that Benton had failed to pay the taxes that he owed on 3 slaves that he owned. And when Benton was asked about it, he said that he didn't want to pay any attention to what a puppy had to say about him. Well, calling a man a puppy was considered quite an insult at the time. And so Charles Lucas, wrote a note demanding satisfaction. And their seconds got together for what they called a personal interview, so to speak. That's actually the term they used, I think, maybe to avoid the problems with the law, and agreed to meet on Bloody Island, which at the time was an island in the Mississippi River between Missouri, St. Louis, and Illinois. And in the first duel, Lucas was wounded, severely wounded, but he wasn't killed. But Benton demanded they have a second duel. Lucas was reluctant, but of course he couldn't back down because it would have, sullied his honor. And so they did have a second duel. And this time Lucas was mortally wounded. And as he lay dying, Benton went up to him and asked him to forgive him. Lucas failed to do it. He said, I won't. And then he said, well, I do forgive you. I do forgive you. And he died. And Benton, of course, went on to become the senator for about 30 years, I guess. And up to 1850. And but he said that the thing he regretted most in life was that he had his duel with Charles Lucas.
So is that story pretty common? I mean, do most people know about the duel?
Well, at the time, it was controversial, but of course it didn't hurt the political chances.
Yeah.
One thing, those kinds of things were accepted amongst the elite, at least in St. Louis. in Missouri, those people have duels.
Yeah.
Not supposed to do it, but who's going to stop them? Because the people who would enforce it are the same people who come from the
Yeah.
same
Mm-hmm.
society. So,
Mm.
yeah, they duels were, I would say, common, but they did occur up until maybe into the 1820s. There were a few famous ones, and then they sort of tailed away. There actually was a duel that I'm aware of that occurred after the Civil War. The last one I ever heard of, a couple of guys who were Civil War veterans got into it over issues relating to the Civil War, insulting Jefferson Davis or something. And anyway, they took a couple of pot shots at each other. Nobody was hurt.
Uh,
Holds well that ends well, I guess.
Yeah. So tell me, I know that you each have written other books, and I know, I believe you were scheduled to visit the Boone County History and Cultural Center last spring to talk about your book on the steamboats in Missouri. Right. Did you come for that visit, or was that canceled?
That was canceled.
That was canceled because of the pandemic, I guess.
Yes.
Well, so what other topics have you written about? Steamboats and crime.
Well, we wrote about the steamboat disasters, and that was our first book that we wrote together.
Ooh.
And I had written, I did a pictorial history of Mexico, Missouri, and of Kirkwood, Missouri. And I did then and now, comparing and contrasting buildings and how they had changed in St. Charles, called Then and Now St. Charles. And then my first true crime book, which I wrote with my son, was Slaying in South St. Louis, about a murder by a 15-year-old boy in South St. Louis, the 1960s, early 1960s. I also have written a lot of children's books.
I see. And I know that you owned a bookstore in St. Charles for a while, I saw. So how about you, Jim? What books have you?
I have 3 books on the Civil War in Missouri. One about the guerrillas. One about
really?
soldiers who fought the guerrillas, and one about the home front, for lack of a better word, but mainly about civilians and other kind of miscellaneous topics in Civil War Missouri. I also have a book on the history of St. Charles, the city and county of St. Charles.
What? And I know that Jim, you have some ties to Columbia. I know you went to law school here, correct?
Well, yeah, I went to law school and law school there. Vicki graduated from the university as well.
Right.
And
we met in the library at the university.
Is that right?
Yes.
Ellis Library.
Right. The reading room there.
And are you still involved with any Columbia activities?
Well, I am the treasurer of the Unbound Book Festival, which is
that right?
And it was, of course, virtual this year. But yes, we both. Well, Vicki was involved at the beginning, and she volunteered me to be the treasurer, which I was glad to do. And so I've served in that for, I guess, 5 years, 6 years. I remember now when it started. Yeah, 5 or 6 years now. And hopefully, I'm pretty sure at least, it will be in person again in 2022.
And what how have you been involved with other authors of Missouri history? Is it easy? I mean, is it hard to find people that write about Missouri?
No.
I think a lot of people do write about Missouri history. One of my very good friends just wrote a book about the history of the fashion industry in St. Louis, how it was so strong at one point. And
is that right?
Yeah, called Ready to Wear. And she actually has written several books on, she wrote a book about Columbia, in fact, in Columbia, Missouri, for the same publisher that did Notorious.
Yeah.
And so she's somebody that I, in particular, am close friends with. And we're in writing groups, but right now I'm in a fiction writing group. It's only Valerie is in the group with me, but we mostly concentrate on fiction.
Yeah.
And I mean, my primary interest is in the Civil War, and there's been a lot of books written about the Civil War in Missouri, particularly recently. Some very good ones about the guerrilla war, about Price's raid into Missouri in 1864, and kind of generally about the Civil War in Missouri, military history of the Civil War in Missouri. There are others that date back many, many years that go into political and also civil liberties and so forth. So there's a number of books about Missouri history, particularly in the Civil War or immediately after the Civil War, that I myself have been particularly interested in. And now with the bicentennial, there are books about the Missouri Compromise. Those kinds of things either have come out recently, or I guess will be coming out, or have come out recently.
Yeah. No, it does. I've only lived in Columbia since 1986, but I'm surprised how often I bump into the Civil War as an interest. But I never, I'm from Pennsylvania, and it's I don't think people are as interested in it there as they are here.
Well, maybe around Gettysburg.
Well, yeah, sure.
But when you live on or near the battlefields, why it might make a difference.
Yeah,
I mean, if you had relatives who were at Wilson's Creek, for example, you can jump in the car from be down there in 3 or 4 hours or less, and walk the ground where they walk.
Yeah. So, are you working on a project on Missouri history now?
Well, I'm working on a very long. I've been working on it for years, and probably will continue to work on it for years before I ever finish it, if I do. About the another Civil War book about the Missouri State Militia, which was an organization that was specifically organized to fight guerrillas in the state of Missouri. A group of regiments, about 9 or 10 regiments, and I've been working on that for probably the last 6 or 7 years, and it may be many before I'd ever get anywhere close to finishing it. I'd like to finish it earlier, but I'm going to be realistic about it.
Yeah. How about you, Vicki? Are you working on any history now?
I'm not working on anything history. I'm working on a fiction, a mystery.
So let me ask you: do you ever speak to student groups or to young people, or is it mostly older people like us?
I do. I mean, I used to do it very often. I spoke to school groups, particularly when I was more involved in writing children's books. My last children's book actually wasn't that long ago, and it was a World War II book inspired by a real person in Hawaii who was still alive, and I started up a correspondence with her, and she was very fascinating. It was about German internment during World War II versus Japanese internment, because I had no idea that there had been Germans interned, and both of her parents had been interned, and they were both United States citizens, and that's what made it so unusual, because usually the Germans that were interned were aliens, enemy aliens.
Yeah. So, and where was the German internment camp located? Out in the West as well?
Right. They were in an internment camp in Hawaii. It was up on the island of Oahu. And I know I can see the name written out, but if I try to say it, you still won't know what it is, because there's no way I can. But one of the interesting things about that particular story was Doris was 11 years old when Pearl Harbor happened. And it was the next day that the FBI came and took her parents away. They arrested her father at work, and they arrested her mother from home. They left Doris alone in the house with her 7-year-old sister. With, it made no kind of efforts or anything to tell her what had happened to her parents, or to make sure that she had adult supervision. She was just left there alone. it was very traumatic. And she was not the only one. I mean, she, of course, knew other people by the time that she was, grown that were in the same situation.
One of the things that fascinated me about her story, because I'm a military history nerd, is that you've seen the movies about the attack on Pearl Harbor, Tora, 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 and the other one that came later. There's a scene there where the two American pilots take off and get into a dogfight with the Zeros, like kind of about the only planes that got off the ground. Doris saw that.
Yes.
When she was a child. She
watched that happen. Yes.
Wow. So how did you meet her?
I actually, I've always been interested in internment. I'm not sure what except I think it was that I hadn't learned that in school as I was growing up. I hadn't learned about it. And when I found out that that was something that happened during the war here in the United States, I was appalled that could happen in our country. And I had read another book that was about an internment camp in Texas called Crystal City, and it talked about that it was part Japanese internees and part German internees. Well, that was my first knowledge of German internees, and I kind of started reading more things, and I read an essay by Doris, and that prompted my interest in the story and in me getting in contact with her.
Yeah. That's amazing, because I never heard of German internment either.
Yeah.
I
mean, there were about 12,000 Germans interned, compared to 120,000 Japanese. And like
Jim,
most of them were enemy aliens, and did not have United States citizenship.
Unlike the Japanese.
Yeah.
Right.
I would say, Jim, I know that you practiced law for a long time, 30 years or something. What kind of law did you do? Anything related to history?
Well, I did litigation primarily, and then later on in my career, I more or less specialized in doing appellate work, which was sort of like history. You had to gather evidence, you had to tell a story. Of course, you had a particular story you wanted to turn out a particular way, as opposed to,
Sure.
The evidence might not have been with you each time, so you had to put the best face on it you could. But that was the closest I came to having to delve into history as part of my legal work when I was working on the St. Louis desegregation case, which did involve some delving back into the history of the schools in St. Louis City and St. Louis County.
Was that like in the 1980s, or when would that have been?
Well, the case started in 1972. We became involved in it in about 1980 and stayed involved in it until about 1996. It settled, and then there was things that went on with the settlement, 83 onwards. And so, it was quite a lengthy process, and I think it finally resolved some years after I was no longer participating in it. I think 10 years or more later, it finally was resolved.
Yeah. One of the authors I interviewed this year was Walter Johnson.
Right.
The Heart of America or something. I forget the title at the moment. But I've been interested in.
He appeared at the Unbound Book Festival too. One of our authors.
Oh, did? Is that right? Yeah. He was fascinating though, and the book I think is fascinating. Yeah. Is there anything else you would like to tell us about your book?
No, not really. I will be giving some talks on the book through the Missouri Speakers Bureau over the next 2 or 3 months, and so in various places. So if people tuning in here want to hear something more in person, they might check there to see where I'll be at. So that's one possibility.
Well, thank you very much for talking to us. I enjoyed reading your book.
Thank you. Thank
All
you
right.
for having us.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
So